It was a Tuesday morning in April 1982 when Harold kissed me goodbye for what I thought would be 8 hours. Instead, it was 41 years. "Don't forget the milk," I called after him as he headed to his Ford pickup. Harold turned and smiled that crooked smile that had stolen my heart at 17. "Never do, Rosie. See you tonight." Those were the last words my husband spoke to me for 4 decades. When 6 o'clock came and went without Harold, I figured he'd stopped at Murphy's bar with the boys from the bank. By 8, I was calling his friends. By 10, I was calling hospitals. By midnight, I was filing a missing person report with Officer Mackenzie, who looked at me like I was some hysterical housewife whose husband had finally gotten smart and run off. "Mrs. Patterson," Mackenzie said, tapping his pen against his clipboard, "men don't just vanish into thin air. Usually when a guy doesn't come home, there's a reason. Another woman, gambling debts, that sort of thing." "Not Harold," I said firmly. "We've been married 15 years. He adores our children. Something's happened to him." The officer's expression said he'd heard it all before. The police treated Harold's disappearance like a domestic issue, not a crime. They made a few phone calls, checked with his work, and basically waited for him to turn up or for me to accept that he'd left us. The bank confirmed he'd never shown up that Tuesday. His truck was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a shopping center 20 miles away, keys still in the ignition. No witnesses. No blood. No signs of struggle. Just a man who'd evaporated like morning dew. I hired the first private investigator with money from our savings account. Then a second with money from Harold's life insurance policy that wouldn't pay out without a body. A third with funds from selling my grandmother's jewelry. Each one promised answers and delivered nothing but bills. "Face facts, lady." The last one told me after 6 months of taking my money. "Your husband split. Happens every day." But I knew Harold. He sang lullabies to our babies. He cried during Hallmark commercials. He left little love notes in my lunchbox when I worked at the diner. Men like that don't just disappear. The years crawled by like wounded animals. I worked 3 jobs to keep Tommy and Sarah fed and clothed. Cleaned houses during the day, waited tables at night, took in sewing on weekends. My hands were raw and my back ached, but I kept Harold's memory alive for our children. "Daddy's coming home." I'd tell them when they asked where he was. As they grew older, they stopped asking. Tommy started getting into fights at school when kids said his father was a deadbeat. Sarah became quiet and withdrawn, like she was afraid to love anyone too much in case they disappeared too. "Mom, he's not coming back," Tommy said on his 18th birthday when I set an extra place at the dinner table like I had every night for 6 years. "You need to accept that." But I couldn't. Wouldn't. Somewhere deep in my bones, I felt Harold was alive. Maybe that makes me a fool, but love makes fools of us all. I never remarried, though there were opportunities. How could I, when I didn't know if I was a widow or an abandoned wife? Every year that passed felt like another stone added to my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to hope. Tommy moved to California after college. Sarah married young and moved to Texas. They called on holidays and visited when they could, but I saw the pity in their eyes. Poor Mom, still waiting for a ghost. By 2020, I was 78 and resigned to dying alone. Harold would have been 81 if he was still alive. Our children were grandparents themselves. Life had moved on without us. Then last April, on a Tuesday morning 41 years to the day after Harold disappeared, someone knocked on my door. I nearly dropped my coffee mug when I opened it. Harold stood on my porch, older and grayer, but unmistakably my husband. The same green eyes, the same scar on his chin from falling off his bike as a boy. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, and I suppose he had. "Rose," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know you must hate me, but I can explain everything." I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. The neighbors came running when I started screaming. Not from fear, but from shock so pure it felt like lightning. Harold's story unfolded over coffee at my kitchen table. The same table where we'd shared thousands of meals as newlyweds. He spoke slowly, like each word cost him something precious. He'd been kidnapped, he said. Taken by men who discovered he'd stumbled onto money laundering at the bank. They needed someone with his skills and access, someone who could move money without raising suspicions. They'd threatened to kill me and the children if he didn't cooperate or tried to escape. "They moved me around," Harold explained, showing me scars on his wrists. "Different cities, different jobs, always watching. I tried to escape twice. They made sure I regretted it." His hands shook as he spoke. "I thought about you every day, Rosie. You and Tommy and Sarah. It was the only thing that kept me alive. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. For 41 years, I'd imagined every scenario except abandonment because I knew Harold's heart. This story fit the man I'd married. He moved into the guest room while we figured out what came next. Tommy and Sarah flew in, suspicious but amazed. Harold cried when he saw them, grown adults with families of their own. He'd missed everything: graduations, weddings, the births of his grandchildren. "We need to call the FBI," Tommy said. "These people need to be brought to justice." Harold flinched. "They're still out there. If they know I'm here." "Dad, it's been 40 years, Sarah said gently. "Most of them are probably dead." But Harold seemed terrified of any official involvement. He said he just wanted to live quietly, to make up for lost time. I understood his fear. 41 years of captivity would break anyone's spirit. For 2 weeks, we lived in a strange kind of limbo. Harold helped with my garden. We watched old movies and talked about the children we'd raised apart. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the man I'd married, and my heart would flutter like a teenager's. Then I found the phone. I was doing laundry, checking pockets like I had when Harold lived here before. His coat contained receipts, breath mints, and a smartphone I didn't recognize. It was unlocked, and curiosity got the better of me. The photos made my blood freeze. Harold at birthday parties. Harold at Christmas dinners. Harold walking a woman down the aisle, at what looked like a wedding. But these weren't old photos from before his disappearance. The dates showed they were recent, some within the last year. And Harold wasn't alone in them. There was a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, her arm linked through his. Children who had his nose, his smile. Grandchildren playing in a yard I'd never seen. At the bottom of the photo album was a picture that stopped my heart. Harold and the silver-haired woman cutting a cake that said, "Happy 30th anniversary." I sank onto my bed, the phone trembling in my hands. 30 years. He'd been married to someone else for 30 years while I waited for him like some pathetic spinster. When Harold came in from the garden, he found me sitting there with the evidence of his betrayal spread across my bedspread like a crime scene. "Rosie," he started, but I held up my hand. "Who is she?" My voice was steady, which surprised me. Inside, I was screaming. Harold's face crumpled. "Her name is Sarah, like our daughter. I met her in Oregon about 10 years after I left." "You mean after you abandoned us?" "It wasn't like that. I was in trouble, Rosie. Gambling debts. Bad people were after me. I panicked and ran, and then I was too ashamed to come back. The kidnapping story dissolved like sugar in rain. So you started a new life. A new family." I told her I was a widower. I never meant for it to go so far, but one lie led to another, and before I knew it, we had a life together. Kids, grandkids. 30 years worth of lies. Harold's shoulders shook. "Sarah died last year. Cancer. And her kids. Our kids. They found out about you and Tommy and our Sarah. They want nothing to do with me now." The truth hit me like a physical blow. "So you came back because you had nowhere else to go?" "No. I came back because I missed you. Because I never stopped loving you. You loved me so much you replaced me with another woman who shared our daughter's name. We stared at each other across 4 decades of deception. This broken old man wasn't the Harold I'd been waiting for. That Harold existed only in my memories. What do you want from me?" I asked. "Forgiveness. A chance to make things right." I laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Make things right? Harold, you stole 41 years from me. From our children. There's no making that right." But even as I said it, I felt the familiar pull of love. Not for this stranger who'd deceived me, but for the ghost of the man I'd married. The father of my children. The first person who'd ever told me I was beautiful. "You can stay 2 weeks, I told him. "Figure out where you're going next, but you're not staying here. This isn't your home anymore." Harold nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you understand anything. I wasted my entire life waiting for a man who was building a new one without me. Our children grew up thinking their father didn't love them enough to stay. I never remarried, never moved on, never lived. I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover this, does it? No, it doesn't. As I write this, Harold is packing his few belongings. He's found a senior community in Arizona that will take him. Our children think I'm being too generous giving him 2 weeks, but at my age, I've learned that forgiveness isn't for the person who wronged you. It's for yourself. I'm not taking Harold back. That woman who waited 41 years is gone, and good riddance to her. But I won't send him away to die alone either. That's not who I am. Some stories don't have happy endings. Sometimes the best you can hope for is the strength to close one chapter and begin writing another. At 79, I'm finally ready to live for myself instead of a memory. Tomorrow is Wednesday. I think I'll go buy myself some flowers. Wanting to see what would happen next, subscribe to this channel too. Get to listen to more of our upcoming exciting stories. Click on the subscribe button now. Thank you. Harold left on a Thursday morning in May, 3 suitcases and 41 years of lies packed into the back of a taxi. I watched from my kitchen window as he loaded his belongings, hunched over like the weight of his deceptions had finally bent his spine. He didn't look back at the house where we'd started our life together, where our children had taken their first steps, where I'd waited for him like some fool heroine in a tragic romance. Part of me wanted to run after that taxi, to forgive him everything just to not be alone anymore. But the stronger part, the part that had survived 4 decades of abandonment, knew that some bridges burn so completely there's no walking back across the ashes. The silence he left behind was different from the silence I'd grown used to. Before, the quiet had been filled with possibility, with the hope that any moment might bring news, a phone call, a knock on the door. Now it was just empty, echoing with the sound of my own footsteps and the tick of the grandfather clock Harold's father had given us as a wedding present. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn spot where Harold had rested his elbows for 2 weeks, trying to convince me that 30 years of lies were somehow forgivable. The morning light slanted through the curtains I'd sewn in 1981, illuminating dust motes that danced without purpose, much like I had for most of my adult life. My phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Mom, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." The lie came easily after years of practice. "Tommy and I were talking. Maybe you should consider selling the house. Moving somewhere smaller, closer to one of us." I looked around my kitchen, at the pencil marks on the doorframe tracking Tommy and Sarah's growth, at the handprint tiles they'd made in elementary school still hanging by the stove. "This is my home. It's too big for one person. And after everything with Dad, your father made his choices 41 years ago. I'm not letting them drive me from my home now." Sarah sighed, a sound I'd heard countless times over the years whenever she thought I was being stubborn. "At least think about it. Promise me." I promised to think about it. Another lie, but a small one. After she hung up, I wandered through the house, seeing it with fresh eyes. The living room where I'd taught the children to play piano on the old upright I'd bought at a garage sale. The bathroom where I'd given them baths, where Harold used to make them laugh by giving himself a bubble beard. The master bedroom where I'd slept alone for 41 years, always on my side of the bed, as if saving space for a man who was building a life with someone else 3,000 miles away. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to let go. But not today. Today, I needed to remember how I'd gotten here, how I'd survived the years when every sunrise felt like a betrayal because it meant Harold had been gone another day. The first year after Harold disappeared was the hardest. Not just emotionally, though God knows that nearly killed me, but practically. Harold had been the breadwinner. My part-time job at Miller's Diner barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage, utilities, and everything 2 growing children needed. Tommy was 11 then, all knees and elbows and righteous anger at a father who'd left without explanation. Sarah was 8, still young enough to believe fairy tales came true and Daddy would come home with a good reason for being away so long. "Where's Daddy?" she'd ask every night at dinner, her small face turned toward his empty chair. "He's working, baby. He'll be home soon." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but what else could I tell her? That the police thought her father was a deadbeat who'd abandoned his family? That I lay awake every night terrified he was dead in a ditch somewhere? That the bills were piling up, and I didn't know how we'd make it through the month? By Christmas of 1982, I'd sold Harold's coin collection, my engagement ring, and most of our good furniture. I kept the dining room set because I couldn't bear the thought of the children eating Christmas dinner at a card table. I set Harold's place like always, ignoring Tommy's eye roll and Sarah's hopeful glance at the door every time the wind rattled the house. "He's not coming, Mom," Tommy said, his voice cracking with the beginnings of adolescence and too much responsibility for his age. "He might," Sarah whispered, cutting her ham into tiny pieces she barely touched. I reached across the table and squeezed her small hand. "That's right, sweetheart. He might." But privately, I was starting to wonder if Tommy was right. Not because I believed Harold had abandoned us, that possibility still felt impossible, but because if something had happened to him, if someone had hurt him, wouldn't we have found his body by now? Wouldn't there be some trace, some clue? The second year was when I learned what real exhaustion felt like. I'd taken a job cleaning offices downtown, starting at 5 in the morning before the business day began. Then I'd race home to get the kids ready for school, sleep for 2 hours, pick them up in the afternoon, help with homework, make dinner, and head to my evening shift at the diner. Mrs. Chun next door watched the children when I worked nights, bless her soul. She never asked for payment, just accepted the casseroles I made in return and pretended not to notice when I showed up at her door hollow-eyed and shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. "You cannot keep this pace," she told me one evening as I picked up Tommy and Sarah. "You will make yourself sick." "I'm fine," I insisted, swaying slightly on my feet. "When did you last eat a full meal?" A real meal, not crackers standing at the counter. I couldn't remember. Food had become fuel, something to grab between jobs or shove down while helping with homework. The weight was falling off me, and not in a good way. My clothes hung loose, and I'd developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. "The children need their mother healthy," Mrs. Chun said gently. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My cheeks were hollow, my eyes sunken, my hair lank and lifeless. I looked like a refugee from my own life. I started taking vitamins and forcing myself to eat breakfast, even when my stomach churned with anxiety about money. The bills never stopped coming, and there was never enough to cover them all. I learned to prioritize mortgage first, then utilities, then food. Everything else could wait. The phone company cut off our service twice that second year. Each time, I'd scraped together enough for a partial payment and promised the rest soon. The woman at the phone company knew me by name, knew my situation, and probably bent the rules more than once to keep us connected. "Mrs. Patterson," she'd say when I called, "I can give you another week, but after that, my supervisor will want to know why we're carrying your account." "I understand. Thank you. Really, thank you so much." Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. I applied for food stamps, stood in line at the food bank, accepted hand-me-down clothes from neighbors. Each small humiliation chipped away at the woman I'd been, but it also forged something harder in me. I was a mother first, everything else second. Tommy started acting out at school that year. Fighting, talking back to teachers, getting detention. The guidance counselor called me in for a meeting, a stern woman with kind eyes who'd seen too many broken families. "Tommy's angry," she said without preamble. "He's carrying a lot of responsibility for his age." "I know. I'm doing the best I can. I'm not criticizing you. Single mothers face impossible challenges. But Tommy needs an outlet for his feelings, and right now, that outlet is his fists." She recommended counseling, which we couldn't afford. Instead, I signed Tommy up for Little League, scraping together the fee by skipping lunch for 2 weeks. The physical activity helped, and Coach Martinez became a father figure of sorts, praising Tommy's arm while teaching him that real men controlled their tempers. Sarah's response to Harold's absence was different, but no less heartbreaking. She became the perfect child, helpful, quiet, never asking for anything. She'd set the table without being asked, fold laundry with meticulous care, and get herself ready for school while I was at my early cleaning job. One morning I came home to find her making breakfast for Tommy, standing on a chair to reach the stove, her 8-year-old face set in concentration as she flipped pancakes. "Baby, you don't have to do that," I said, rushing to take the spatula from her small hands. "I know, Mama. But you're tired, and Tommy gets grumpy when he's hungry." The matter-of-fact way she said it broke something in me. I pulled her into my arms and held her tight, smelling the baby shampoo in her hair and fighting back tears. "You're not the mother, sweetheart. That's my job." "I know. But Daddy's not here to help you, so I have to." 8 years old, and she was already trying to fill the void Harold had left behind. By the 3rd year, I'd added weekend sewing to my routine. Mrs. Patterson down the street had mentioned that her church group needed someone to hem dresses and take in suits. Word spread, and soon I had a steady stream of alterations work that I could do at home while keeping an eye on the children. I'd sit at Harold's mother's old Singer sewing machine, the one I'd inherited when she passed, working by lamplight while Tommy did homework at the kitchen table and Sarah played with her dolls on the living room floor. The familiar rhythm of the machine was soothing, and the work paid better than minimum wage. "Mom, why don't you just marry Mr. Peterson?" Tommy asked one evening, not looking up from his math homework. Jim Peterson was a widower who'd been asking me to dinner for months. He was kind, stable, and clearly interested in more than friendship. His wife had died of cancer 2 years earlier, leaving him with a teenage daughter who seemed to like me well enough. "Because I'm already married," I said, not missing a stitch. To someone who left us. To someone who's missing. There's a difference. Tommy looked up then, his face older than his 13 years. Is there? Really? I stopped sewing and met his eyes. Yes, there is. But late at night, when the children were asleep and the house creaked around me, I wondered if Tommy was right. Was there really a difference between abandoned and missing when the result was the same? Loneliness, struggle, and 2 children growing up without their father. The 4th year brought new challenges. Sarah started asking harder questions about Harold's absence, questions that Daddy's working couldn't answer anymore. She was old enough to understand that fathers didn't usually work for years without coming home, smart enough to notice that I cried sometimes when I thought she wasn't looking. Is Daddy ever coming home? She asked one night as I tucked her into bed. I sat on the edge of her mattress, brushing her hair back from her forehead. I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. But you don't know for sure. No, I don't know for sure. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this admission with the gravity of a child forced to grow up too fast. If he doesn't come back, will we be okay? Yes, I said with more certainty than I felt. We'll be okay because we have each other. And because you're strong. And because you and Tommy are strong too. But strength felt like a finite resource, something I was using up a little more each day. The constant worry about money, about the children, about Harold, was wearing me down like water on stone. Some mornings I woke up and didn't know how I'd make it through another day of pretending everything was manageable. That was the year Jim Peterson stopped asking me to dinner. Not because he'd lost interest, but because he'd finally understood that I wasn't available, not really. My heart was still holding space for a man who might be dead, might be hurt, might be somewhere thinking about us and trying to find his way home. I'll wait, Jim told me one evening after walking me home from the diner. However long it takes. Don't, I said softly. Don't put your life on hold for me. Too late for that, Rose. But I couldn't let him sacrifice his happiness for my uncertainty. I stopped accepting his offers to help with repairs around the house, declined his invitations to church picnics and school events. It hurt to push away kindness, but it would have hurt more to let him hope for something I couldn't give. The 5th year was when Tommy started talking about getting a job after school, despite being only 14. He'd seen me counting bills at the kitchen table, had noticed that we ate more spaghetti and beans than meat, understood that his outgrown clothes weren't being replaced as quickly as they once were. I could work at Johnson's Grocery, he said. Bagging groceries, stocking shelves. They hire kids. Your job is school, I told him firmly. But we need the money. We're managing. Are we? Really? Because I heard you crying in your room last night. I'd thought the children were asleep when I'd finally let myself break down over a pile of bills I couldn't pay. Apparently I'd been wrong. Sometimes adults cry, Tommy. It doesn't mean we're not managing. It doesn't mean we are either. He was right, but admitting it felt like giving up. As long as I could keep the family together, keep food on the table and a roof over our heads, I was winning. The moment I admitted we were drowning, Harold's absence would have beaten us. Christmas of 1986 was particularly hard. The children were old enough to notice that our tree was smaller than previous years, that there were fewer presents underneath, that I'd made their gifts instead of buying them. Sarah loved the doll clothes I'd sewn, and Tommy genuinely seemed to enjoy the wooden baseball bat I'd found at a thrift store and refinished, but I saw them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I set Harold's place at the table like always, and for the first time, neither child commented. Sarah was 11 now, old enough to understand that hope could be as painful as reality. Tommy was 15, more man than boy, his shoulders already broader than his father's had been. Maybe next year we could just set 3 places, Tommy said quietly as we cleaned up after dinner. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Why would we do that? Because he's been gone for 4 years, Mom. For years. Even if something happened to him, even if he didn't leave on purpose, he's probably not. Don't. The word came out sharper than I intended. Don't say it. Someone has to. Someone has to say what we're all thinking. But I wasn't ready to hear it, wasn't ready to give up the hope that had sustained me through 4 years of struggle. Hope was all I had left of Harold, all I had left of the woman I'd been before that Tuesday morning when my world tilted sideways. 1 more year, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Give me 1 more year. Tommy and Sarah exchanged another look, one that spoke of conversations they'd had without me, plans they'd made to protect me from a truth I wasn't ready to face. Okay, Mom, Sarah said, slipping her small hand into mine. 1 more year. But I could see in their eyes that they'd already given up, already accepted what I couldn't bear to consider. Their father was gone, and wherever he was, whatever had happened to him, he wasn't coming home. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat in Harold's chair, the one I never let anyone else use, and tried to imagine a future without him. A future where I stopped setting his place at the table, stopped checking the mailbox for letters that would never come, stopped listening for his key in the door. The future looked impossibly lonely, but maybe loneliness was better than the constant ache of hope deferred. Maybe Tommy was right. Maybe it was time to let go. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, I was still Rose Patterson, the woman whose husband had kissed her goodbye on a Tuesday morning and promised to bring home milk. Tomorrow, I might be Rose Patterson, the woman whose husband had abandoned his family for reasons she'd never understand. The difference between those two women felt like the difference between living and merely surviving. I wasn't ready to just survive. Not yet. Time has a way of blurring the edges of memory, softening the sharp corners of pain, until what once felt unbearable becomes simply the way things are. By 2023, 41 years had passed since Harold walked out our front door with a promise to bring home milk. 41 years of birthdays without him, of Christmases with an empty chair, of graduations where other fathers walked their daughters down aisles while I sat alone in church pews. I was 79 years old, moving a little slower each morning, my hands arthritic from decades of cleaning and sewing, and holding our family together with nothing but stubborn will. The house felt larger now that it was just me rattling around in it, though I'd refused every suggestion from Tommy and Sarah to sell it and move somewhere smaller. This was my home, the place where I'd raised my children and waited for a husband who never came back. Tommy was 52 now, a grandfather himself with silver threading through the dark hair he'd inherited from Harold. He lived in San Diego with his wife Maria and their twin granddaughters, visiting twice a year with the dutiful love of a son who'd learned early that the world was an unreliable place. Sarah, at 49, had settled in Austin after her divorce, working as a school librarian and raising her teenage son Marcus with the fierce independence I'd accidentally taught her. Both my children had long ago stopped asking if I was ready to move on, stopped suggesting I might want to travel or take up hobbies that would fill the empty hours. They'd learned to work around my rituals the way you work around furniture that's been in the same place for decades. The extra place setting at holidays, the way I still called Harold's old workshop Daddy's room. The photograph on my nightstand showing a young man with laughing eyes who'd been frozen in time for 4 decades. Mrs. Chun had passed away in 2019, and the new neighbors, a young couple with a toddler, were kind but distant. They probably thought I was the crazy old lady who talked to herself in the garden, though really I was just telling Harold about my day the way I'd been doing for 41 years. Old habits die hard, and hope dies harder still. That Tuesday morning in April started like any other. I'd made my coffee, taken my blood pressure medication, and settled at the kitchen table with the newspaper, squinting at the headlines through reading glasses that never seemed quite strong enough anymore. The morning light slanted through the same curtains I'd sewn in 1981, faded now but too familiar to replace. I was reading about some political scandal that would be forgotten by next week when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the front door, confident but not aggressive. Probably the mail carrier with a package, I thought, or maybe that nice boy from down the street selling something for his school fundraiser. I shuffled to the door in my house slippers, coffee mug still in hand, already reaching for my purse to buy whatever cookies or magazines or raffle tickets were being offered. Helping children was one of the few joys left in my careful, quiet life. I opened the door and nearly dropped my coffee mug on the front porch. Harold stood there. Not the Harold of my memories, young and strong with calloused hands and eyes full of dreams, but an old man with silver hair and deep lines carved around eyes that were still unmistakably green. He was thinner than he'd been, his shoulders stooped, wearing clothes that looked expensive but hung loose on his frame as if he'd recently lost weight. His hands shook slightly as he gripped a worn leather briefcase. But it was Harold. Every instinct I possessed, every cell in my body that had loved this man for over 60 years, recognized him instantly. "Rose," he whispered, and his voice cracked like he hadn't spoken in years. "I know you must hate me, but I can explain everything." The coffee mug hit the porch and shattered, sending ceramic shards and hot liquid across my slippers. I couldn't feel the burn, couldn't feel anything except the rushing sound of my own blood in my ears, and the impossible sight of my husband standing on my doorstep like some fever dream made flesh. I opened my mouth to speak, But what came out instead was a sound I'd never heard myself make. A keening wail that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in my chest where I'd buried 41 years of grief. It was the sound of a woman seeing a ghost, of hope and rage and disbelief colliding with the force of a train wreck. "Harold," I gasped, the name feeling foreign on my tongue after so many years of keeping it locked away in my heart. He stepped forward, one hand reaching toward me, and I stumbled backward into my hallway. This couldn't be real. Harold was dead, or he'd abandoned us, or he was living somewhere with another family. He couldn't just appear on my doorstep like nothing had happened, like 41 years was a long weekend instead of most of my adult life. "Rose, please let me explain." "Explain?" The word came out as a shriek that probably carried to the street. "Explain where you've been for 41 years? Explain why you never called, never wrote, never gave us any sign you were alive." Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came running across her lawn in her bathrobe, her phone already in her hand. "Rose, are you okay? Should I call 911? Behind her, I could see curtains twitching in windows up and down the street as neighbors emerged to investigate the commotion. Someone was recording with their phone, probably young Jake from the corner house who posted everything on social media. "I'm fine," I called to Mrs. Rodriguez, though I was anything but fine. I was breaking apart like that coffee mug, 41 years of carefully constructed composure cracking under the weight of the impossible. Harold looked around nervously at the gathering crowd. "Rose, maybe we could talk inside? Please." Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to pretend this was all a hallucination brought on by too much blood pressure medication and too many years of solitude. But the larger part, the part that had never stopped loving him despite everything, stepped aside to let him into the house we'd once shared. He walked slowly through my front hallway, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with something that looked like hunger. The same wallpaper, though faded. The same family photos on the hallway table, though they stopped abruptly in 1982. The same smell of lemon furniture polish and the lavender sachets I tucked into closets. "You kept everything the same," he said softly. "I kept everything the same for the first 10 years, I corrected, my voice steadier now that we were inside, away from the neighbors' prying eyes. "After that, I just didn't see the point in changing anything. This was our home. It felt wrong to erase you completely. We stood in my living room like strangers, which I supposed we were now." Harold perched on the edge of the sofa like he was afraid to settle in, while I remained standing by the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest like armor. "You look good," he said, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "I look old. Because I am old. Because 41 years have passed since you walked out that door." "I didn't walk out. Not the way you think." "Then how? How do you walk out of someone's life for 4 decades and then just show up like you've been at the grocery store?" Harold set his briefcase carefully on the coffee table and leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "I was taken, Rose. Kidnapped. By people who needed someone with my skills, someone who could move money around without attracting attention." I stared at him. "Kidnapped. I know how it sounds. But it's the truth. They approached me at the bank that Tuesday morning, told me they knew about the irregularities I'd discovered in some of the corporate accounts. They said I could either help them willingly, or they'd make sure you and the children paid the price for my curiosity." The story spilled out of him like water through a broken dam. How he'd stumbled across evidence of money laundering while reviewing loan applications. How 2 men in expensive suits had cornered him in the parking lot and made it clear that silence wasn't an option, cooperation was. How they'd driven him away from everything he loved with promises that his family would be safe as long as he did what they asked. "They moved me around constantly," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Different cities, different identities, always under watch. I processed their money, helped them clean it through legitimate businesses, created shell companies and false records. I was good at it, Rose. Too good. They couldn't afford to let me go." I sank into my chair, the one I'd sat in every evening for 4 decades, and tried to process what he was telling me. "You're saying you've been a prisoner for 41 years. A very comfortable prisoner, but yes. They gave me apartments, cars, everything I needed except freedom. I had handlers who watched me constantly, who made sure I never tried to contact you or the children. They showed me photos of you sometimes, to remind me what would happen if I didn't cooperate. Photos of me? You at the grocery store. Walking the children to school. Working at the diner. They wanted me to know they could reach you anytime they wanted." His voice broke on the last words. The hardest thing was seeing how much you were struggling and not being able to help. I thought about those first terrible years, working 3 jobs, counting pennies, falling asleep over homework I was helping Tommy with while Harold was apparently living in comfortable captivity somewhere, watching my life fall apart from a distance. If they were watching us, why didn't I ever see them? Why didn't anyone else notice? They were professionals, Rose. This wasn't some street gang or small-time operation. These were people with resources, with connections, with the ability to make problems disappear permanently. Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I kept records. Names, dates, transactions. Everything I could remember without arousing suspicion. I knew someday I might need proof. I stared at the folder without touching it. Proof of what? That I didn't leave you willingly. That every day away from you and Tommy and Sarah was torture. That I thought about you constantly, dreamed about coming home, planned for the day when I might be free. And now you're free? Just like that. After 41 years, they just let you go. Harold's face darkened. The man who ran the operation died last year. Heart attack. His son tried to take over, but he was sloppy careless. The FBI started closing in on their money laundering network. In the chaos, I saw my chance and I took it. You escaped. I disappeared. Changed my identity one more time, but this time for myself instead of them. I've been careful covering my tracks, making sure I wasn't followed. It took me almost a year to work up the courage to come here. A year. I stood up abruptly, anger flaring hot and bright in my chest. You've been free for a year and you're just now coming home? I had to be sure it was safe. These people don't just forget about loose ends, Rose. If they thought I was a threat, if they believed I might testify against them or turn over evidence, they'd what? Kill me? Kill our children? Like you've been telling yourself for 41 years to justify staying away. It wasn't a justification. It was reality. You have no idea what these people were capable of. I laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You're right. I have no idea. Because I've spent the last 41 years thinking you were dead, Harold. Dead or gone by choice, but either way, lost to us forever. Do you know what that does to a person? Do you know what it did to Tommy and Sarah? Tell me. His voice was barely a whisper. Tommy spent his teenage years getting into fights because other kids said his father was a deadbeat who'd abandoned his family. Sarah became so afraid of loving anyone that she didn't trust a man enough to marry him until she was 35, and even then it didn't last because she was always waiting for him to leave too. Harold's face crumpled. I'm sorry. God, Rose, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't give us back 41 years. Sorry doesn't make up for the school plays you missed, the graduations, the weddings. Sorry doesn't explain why you never found a way to send us a message, some sign that you were alive. I tried. Early on, I tried to send coded messages to find ways to let you know. But you stopped trying, didn't you? At some point, it became easier to just accept your comfortable prison than to fight for your family. The accusation hung in the air between us like a sword. Harold opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of truth. I thought about you every day, he said finally. Every single day. I have pictures. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a small photo album, its edges worn from handling. He opened it carefully, revealing page after page of newspaper clippings, grainy surveillance photos, and what looked like pictures taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. They let me keep these, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My handler said it would help keep me motivated, reminded of what I had to lose. I saw myself in those photos, but it was like looking at a stranger. There was Rose at 38, thin and tired, walking out of the grocery store with 2 children in tow. Rose at 45, standing at Tommy's high school graduation in a dress I'd sewn myself because we couldn't afford anything new. Rose at 52, walking Sarah down the aisle at her wedding because there was no father to do it. 41 years of my life, documented by strangers, collected like trophies by the husband who'd been forced to watch from afar. I aged, I said, staring at the progression of photos. I got old waiting for you. You're still beautiful. I'm not. I'm an old woman whose life passed her by while she waited for a ghost. Harold closed the album carefully. I know I can never make up for the time we've lost. I know I can't undo the pain I've caused. But I'm here now, Rose. I'm free, and I'm here, and I love you just as much as I did that Tuesday morning when I kissed you goodbye. I looked at this stranger with my husband's eyes and tried to feel something other than exhaustion. For 41 years, I'd dreamed of this moment. Harold walking through the door with an explanation, a reason, proof that he hadn't chosen to leave us. I'd imagined throwing myself into his arms, crying tears of joy, feeling complete again for the first time in decades. Instead, I felt empty, hollowed out, like a house after a flood, all the furniture ruined, and the walls still standing, but nothing inside worth saving. Our children are grandparents, Harold. Tommy has twin granddaughters who are 8 years old. Sarah has a 16-year-old son who's never even heard your name except as a cautionary tale about men who leave. I want to meet them. I want to know my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. I want to be part of this family again. What family? We stopped being a family the day you disappeared. We became something else, survivors, maybe, or refugees from the life we'd planned. But not a family. Families don't have 41-year gaps in them. Harold stood up slowly, his age showing in the careful way he moved. Then let me help you become a family again. Let me try to earn back what I lost. You can't earn back time, Harold. You can't earn back Tommy's childhood or Sarah's wedding or any of the thousands of moments that make up a life. Those moments are gone forever. But we can make new moments. We can start over. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Start over at 79 and 81? Start over with a man who was essentially a stranger now, whose life for the past 4 decades was a mystery wrapped in claims of kidnapping and forced servitude. I need time, I said finally. I need time to think, to process this, to figure out what it means. Of course. I understand. I can get a hotel room, give you space. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. If you're really Harold, if you're really my husband, then you'll stay here tonight. In the guest room. Because despite everything, despite all the anger and hurt and confusion, I can't bear the thought of you walking out that door again. Relief flooded his face, making him look younger for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This doesn't mean I forgive you. This doesn't mean we're picking up where we left off. This just means I'm not ready to say goodbye again, not tonight. Harold nodded, understanding. What about Tommy and Sarah? Will you tell them? I thought about my children, grown now with lives and families of their own, both of them having made peace long ago with their father's absence. How do you call your 52-year-old son and tell him his dead father just showed up for dinner? I'll call them tomorrow. Tonight, I need to figure out if I believe you. If any of this is real, or if I've finally lost my mind completely. It's real, Rose. I'm real. I'm here, and I'm not leaving again. But as I showed Harold to the guest room, setting out towels that smelled of the lavender sachets I'd been using for 41 years, I wondered if real was enough. If love could survive 4 decades of absence, if trust could be rebuilt from nothing, if 2 old people could find their way back to each other across an ocean of lost time. That night, I lay awake in my bed listening to the sound of someone else breathing in my house for the first time in 41 years. Harold was 3 rooms away, but he might as well have been on the moon for all the distance that stretched between us. He was back. My husband, my Harold, the man I'd loved and mourned and waited for, was sleeping under my roof. It should have felt like a miracle, like the answer to 4 decades of prayers. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a different kind of heartbreak altogether. If you're still listening to this story up to this point, why don't you subscribe to this channel to continue getting impactful daily stories like this? We would be most grateful if you can do that to help boost this video to reach everyone. Thank you. For 3 weeks, I lived in a strange sort of limbo, sharing my house with a man who looked like my husband but felt like a stranger. Harold moved through our home with the careful politeness of a guest, asking permission to use the shower, offering to help with dishes, sitting stiffly on the edge of furniture like he was afraid to leave an impression. He told me stories during those weeks, carefully crafted tales of captivity that painted him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. How they'd moved him from Detroit to Chicago to Phoenix, always under assumed names, always under watch. How he'd worked for various front companies, legitimate businesses that served as covers for the money laundering operation. How he'd lived in nice apartments but never felt at home, surrounded by luxury but knowing it was all a gilded cage. The details were convincing. Harold had always been good with numbers, good with stories, good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. He showed me the scars on his wrists that he claimed came from restraints during his first escape attempt. He described the handlers who'd watched him, the safe houses where he'd been kept, the elaborate system of threats that had kept him compliant for 4 decades. I wanted to believe him so badly it felt like a physical ache in my chest. Here was the explanation I'd dreamed of for 41 years, the proof that Harold hadn't chosen to abandon us, that he'd been as much a victim as we were. It would mean I hadn't wasted my life waiting for a man who didn't love me enough to stay. It would mean my faith in him, my stubborn refusal to give up hope, had been justified all along. But something felt wrong. Not the big details, those were plausible enough, even impressive in their scope and consistency. It was the small things that nagged at me. The way Harold seemed too comfortable with modern technology for someone who'd supposedly been cut off from normal life for decades. The way he knew things about current events that seemed beyond what someone in captivity would know. The way he sometimes forgot to act traumatized, forgot to look over his shoulder or flinch at unexpected sounds. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. 41 years of abandonment would make anyone suspicious, even of miracles. I called Tommy and Sarah, breaking the news as gently as I could, watching their faces on the video call shift from disbelief to shock to something that looked almost like grief all over again. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, her librarian's training helping her choose her words with precision. "Are you sure it's really him? People can change a lot in 41 years. I know my husband's hands," I told her, which was true. Harold still had the same long fingers, the same scar on his thumb from a childhood accident with his father's saw. "I know his eyes. It's him." Tommy was more direct. "What does he want?" "Money. A place to stay. Because if he thinks he can just waltz back into our lives after 4 decades. He doesn't want anything," I interrupted, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "He just wants to be home." Both my children promised to visit soon, to meet this father who'd returned from the dead, but I could hear the reservation in their voices. They'd made peace with Harold's absence long ago. His return wasn't the miracle to them that it was to me. It was an unwelcome disruption of lives they'd built without him. Harold spent his days reading in the living room or working in the garden, areas where I'd always imagined him if he came home. He was helpful without being intrusive, cooking simple meals when I was tired, fixing the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that I'd been meaning to call a plumber about for months. It was almost like being married again, except for the careful distance we maintained, the way we still called each other Mr. and Mrs. Patterson like polite strangers. At night, I'd lie in my bed listening to him move around the guest room, and sometimes I'd hear him talking quietly, as if he was on the phone. When I asked about it the next morning, he'd claim he'd been talking to himself, a habit he'd developed during his years of isolation. It seemed reasonable. I talked to myself too, had conversations with the empty house that had kept me sane through decades of solitude. It was on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Harold's return, that I discovered the truth that shattered everything I'd allowed myself to hope for. Harold had gone to the grocery store, his first solo venture out of the house since he'd returned. He'd been nervous about it, claiming he wasn't used to being around so many people, but I'd encouraged him to go. Normal activities, I thought, might help him readjust to regular life. He'd kissed my cheek before leaving, a gesture so familiar and yet so strange that it brought tears to my eyes. After he left, I decided to do his laundry. It was a wifely gesture, something normal and domestic that might help bridge the gap between us. I gathered his clothes from the guest room, the expensive-looking shirts and slacks that he claimed had been provided by his captors, along with the jacket he'd worn the day he'd appeared on my doorstep. I was checking pockets before throwing everything in the washing machine, a habit ingrained from 41 years of doing laundry alone, when my fingers closed around something in his coat pocket. Something small and rectangular, and definitely not from 1982. A smartphone. Sleek, modern, obviously expensive. The kind of phone that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I stared at it for a long moment, my hands shaking slightly. Harold had claimed his captors kept him isolated, cut off from normal communication. He'd made a point of marveling at my old flip phone, asking how to use the television remote like someone who'd been frozen in time. But here was a piece of technology that suggested a very different story. The phone was unlocked. Harold had never been good with passwords, always choosing simple ones or none at all. The home screen showed dozens of apps, most of which I didn't recognize, but one icon made my heart race. Photos. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that even as I touched the screen, even as the app opened to reveal hundreds of images, I should have put the phone back, should have waited for Harold to return and asked him to explain. But 41 years of questions demanded answers, and the answers were right there in my trembling hands. The first few photos were recent, pictures of Harold in clothes I recognized from the past 3 weeks, standing in my garden, sitting in my living room. But as I scrolled backward through the timeline, my world began to collapse around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. Harold at a birthday party, blowing out candles on a cake that read, "Happy 65th birthday." But it wasn't a cake I'd ever made, wasn't a party I'd ever attended. He was surrounded by people I'd never seen. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes, her arm linked through his. Children and young adults who shared his facial features. Toddlers playing around his feet. Harold at a Christmas dinner, carving a turkey in a dining room that wasn't mine, wearing a sweater I'd never bought him. The same silver-haired woman beside him, both of them smiling at the camera with the comfortable ease of people who'd shared thousands of such moments. Harold walking a young woman down an aisle decorated with white roses and silver ribbons, his face glowing with fatherly pride as he delivered a bride who looked exactly like Sarah had at that age. But it wasn't Sarah. Our daughter had walked herself down the aisle at her wedding because her father wasn't there to do it. Harold holding a newborn baby, tears streaming down his face, while the silver-haired woman lay exhausted but happy in a hospital bed behind him. The timestamp on the photo was from 15 years ago. Harold teaching a little boy to ride a bicycle in a backyard filled with toys and laughter. Harold at a graduation ceremony, beaming as a young man in cap and gown accepted a diploma. Harold and the silver-haired woman cutting an anniversary cake that read, "Happy 30th anniversary, Sarah and Harold." The woman's name was Sarah. Like our daughter. Harold had replaced our family so completely that he'd even found a woman with the same name as the child he'd abandoned. I sank onto the laundry room floor, the phone clutched in my hands like evidence at a crime scene. Each photo was a knife to the heart, proof that while I'd been working 3 jobs and raising our children alone, while I'd been setting his place at the dinner table every night for 41 years, Harold had been living a completely different life with a completely different family. The photos span decades. This wasn't a recent development, wasn't something that had happened after his supposed escape from captivity. These were 40 years of birthdays and holidays and graduations and weddings and births. 40 years of the life I'd thought we'd share together, but that he'd been sharing with someone else. I scrolled further back, my vision blurring with tears, until I found photos that made my breath catch in my throat. Harold and the other Sarah on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant, surrounded by friends and family I'd never met. The timestamp showed the photo was taken in 1985, 3 years after Harold had disappeared from our lives. 3 years. He'd waited only 3 years before marrying someone else, before starting over with a new identity and a new family while leaving his old one to wonder if he was dead or alive. There were older photos too, pictures of Harold alone in what looked like cheap apartments and motel rooms, his face gaunt and desperate. These must have been from the early years after he'd left us, the years when he was running from whatever had really driven him away. But even in those photos, he didn't look like a kidnapping victim. He looked like a man who'd made a choice and was living with the consequences. The front door slammed, and I heard Harold calling my name. "Rose? I'm back." They had those dinner rolls you like on sale, so I picked up a few extra packages. His voice sounded so normal, so domestic, like he was just my husband returning from an ordinary errand instead of a stranger whose entire story had been built on lies. I scrambled to my feet, shoving the phone into my apron pocket, trying to compose myself before he found me. "Rose? Where are you?" "Laundry room," I called back, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Just finishing up the washing." Harold appeared in the doorway, grocery bags in his hands, looking exactly like the devoted husband he'd been pretending to be for 3 weeks. "You didn't have to do my laundry. I could have taken care of it myself." "It's no trouble," I said, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. That's what wives do. Something in my tone must have alerted him because his eyes sharpened, scanning my face for clues. "Are you all right? You look pale." "Just tired. It's been a long day." He set down the grocery bags and stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch my forehead. I flinched away before I could stop myself, and hurt flashed across his features. "Rose, what's wrong? Did something happen while I was gone?" I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to throw his phone at his lying face and demand to know how he could look me in the eye for 3 weeks while perpetrating such an elaborate deception. But instead, I forced myself to smile, to play the role of the trusting wife just a little longer. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just adjusting to having someone else in the house again. It's been a long time since I've had to think about anyone but myself." The explanation seemed to satisfy him. Harold relaxed, his concerned expression melting into something softer. "I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me too. 41 years is a long time to be apart." "Yes," I agreed, my hand closing around the phone in my pocket. "It certainly is." That evening, We sat in the living room like we had every night since his return, Harold reading a book while I pretended to work on a crossword puzzle. But I couldn't concentrate on the clues. All I could think about were those photos, those decades of stolen moments that should have been ours. Harold looked up from his book and caught me staring at him. "What are you thinking about?" "Just wondering about your time away. You've told me about the big things, but what about the little things? What did you do for fun? Did you have friends? Hobbies?" It was a test, though Harold didn't know it. If his story was true, if he'd really been a prisoner for 41 years, his answer would be different than if he'd been living a normal life with another family. Harold's hesitation was so brief I almost missed it. Fun wasn't really part of the equation. They kept me busy with work, and when I wasn't working, I was usually too exhausted to think about entertainment. I read a lot, when they let me. Old books, mostly classics. They didn't trust me with anything too current. Lies, all of it. The photos on his phone showed barbecues and beach vacations, fishing trips and family game nights. Harold had been having plenty of fun, just not with me. "That must have been lonely," I said, watching his face carefully. "Incredibly lonely. There were times I thought about just ending it all, but then I'd remember you and Tommy and Sarah, and I'd find the strength to keep going. You were my anchor, Rose. The thought of coming home to you was the only thing that kept me alive." The words were exactly what I'd dreamed of hearing for 41 years, but now they felt like poison. Every endearment was a betrayal. Every expression of love was a mockery of the woman who'd wasted her life waiting for a lie. "I'm tired," I said abruptly, standing up from my chair. "I think I'll go to bed early tonight." Harold looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. Sleep well, dear." "Dear." He'd called the other Sarah that in some of the photos, had whispered it in her ear during their anniversary celebration, had written it on birthday cards and Valentine's Day notes that I'd never received. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked through Harold's phone again, memorizing details, building a case against the man I'd once loved more than life itself. The other Sarah had been beautiful, with an easy smile and eyes that sparkled with happiness. She'd aged gracefully beside Harold, growing silver-haired and soft around the edges while remaining vibrant and alive in a way I'd forgotten how to be. Their children, and I had to think of them as their children, not his and mine, looked like Harold but had none of the wariness that Tommy and Sarah had developed after their father's abandonment. These children had grown up secure in their father's love, confident that he'd always be there for them. They'd never wondered if they were worth staying for, never blamed themselves for driving him away. There were photos of Harold teaching his other son to drive, attending his other daughter's college graduation, walking both of them down the aisle at their weddings. All the moments I'd imagined him missing, all the milestones he'd grieved not being present for, he'd actually experienced, just with a different family. The most damning photos were the recent ones, taken after the other Sarah's death. Harold alone in what was clearly their shared home, surrounded by the detritus of a long marriage. Anniversary photos, children's artwork, grandchildren's toys. He'd lived a full life with this woman, had mourned her passing, had been left truly alone for the first time in decades. And so he'd come home to his backup plan. To the wife who'd been waiting faithfully for 41 years, who'd never remarried, never moved on, never stopped believing in a love story that had ended the day he walked out our door. I was his safety net, his fallback option when his real life fell apart. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with pain so intense I couldn't breathe. Tomorrow, I would confront him. Tomorrow, I would demand the truth and watch his carefully constructed story crumble under the weight of evidence. Tomorrow, I would finally close the book on Harold Patterson and the naive woman who'd loved him. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve. Not for Harold. That man had been dead to me for longer than I'd realized. But for Rose, the woman who'd spent 41 years of her life loving a ghost. She deserved better than to discover her devotion had been a joke, her faith a fool's errand, her love a wasted gift offered to someone who'd never deserved it. Outside my bedroom, I could hear Harold moving around. Getting ready for bed like this was all perfectly normal, like he hadn't built his return on a foundation of lies that were about to cost him everything. Again, the difference was, this time, I wouldn't be waiting when he finally decided to come home. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the weight of Harold's betrayal pressing down on my chest like a stone? I lay in my bed, the bed I'd slept in alone for 41 years while he shared another one with another woman, and watched the shadows shift across the ceiling as car headlights passed by on the street outside. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I couldn't spend another day living with his lies, couldn't pretend to believe his carefully crafted story when I had evidence of the truth burning a hole in my apron pocket. 41 years of waiting deserved honesty, even if that honesty destroyed what little was left of my dreams. I made coffee with hands that shook only slightly, years of practice helping me maintain the appearance of calm even when my world was falling apart. Harold appeared in the kitchen at 7:30, dressed in the expensive clothes that I now knew came from a life I'd never been part of, his silver hair neatly combed, and his face wearing the gentle smile he'd been giving me for 3 weeks. "Good morning, dear," he said, reaching for the coffee mug I'd set out for him. "You're up early." I couldn't sleep. I turned from the counter to face him, my hand closing around his phone in my pocket. "We need to talk." Something in my tone must have warned him because his smile faltered slightly. "Of course. What about?" "About Sarah." Harold's face went pale. "Sarah? You mean our daughter? I know I need to call her soon, meet my grandson." "Not our Sarah." I pulled the phone from my pocket and set it on the kitchen table between us like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "The other Sarah. The one you married in 1985. The one you spent 30 years with while I waited for you to come home." The coffee mug slipped from Harold's fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards and hot liquid across the linoleum. He stared at the phone like it was a bomb about to explode, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "I was doing your laundry," I continued, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside me. "I found this in your coat pocket." Imagine my surprise when I discovered 40 years' worth of photos documenting the life you built with another family. "Rose, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because I've looked at every single photo, Harold. I've seen your wedding pictures, your anniversary celebrations, your children's graduations. I've seen you holding grandchildren I'll never meet, walking daughters down aisles I'll never see. So please explain to me how a kidnapped man managed to live such a full and happy life." Harold sank into his chair like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The confident man who'd told me stories of captivity and forced servitude was gone, replaced by someone who looked older than his 81 years, shoulders bent under the weight of 41 years of deception. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he whispered. "What wasn't supposed to happen? The marriage? The children? The decades of lies? Any of it? None of it." He buried his face in his hands. "God, Rose, you have to understand. I never meant for things to go so far." "Then tell me the truth. Not another story, not another carefully crafted explanation. The truth." For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Harold's ragged breathing. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "I got into trouble. Gambling trouble. There were these men, dangerous men, and I owed them more money than I could ever pay back. They were threatening me, threatening you and the kids. I was terrified." The truth started pouring out of him like water through a broken dam, 41 years of secrets spilling across my kitchen table. He'd started gambling at the track after work, just small bets at first, but it had quickly spiraled out of control. By 1982, he owed $20,000 to the wrong kind of people. Men who collected debts with broken bones and worse. "They came to the bank," Harold continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "Told me I had 3 days to pay up, or they'd start with you and the children. I panicked, Rose. I took money from the bank accounts I had access to, thinking I could pay them off, and then figure out how to put it back. You embezzled money. I borrowed it. I was going to replace it, I swear. But when I went to pay them off, they just laughed. Said now I owed them $20,000 plus interest, and if I didn't keep paying, they'd make sure the bank found out about the missing money and you'd lose everything. So he'd run, taken what cash he could get his hands on, and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind a wife who thought he was dead and children who thought they weren't worth staying for. I drove west, Harold said, staring at his hands. Kept driving until I ran out of money in Oregon. I got a job washing dishes under a fake name, lived in a rooming house, sent every penny I could back to those men through intermediaries. It took me 3 years to pay off the debt, 3 years of living like a ghost. And then you met her. Harold nodded miserably. Sarah, the other Sarah, she was a waitress at the restaurant where I worked. She was kind to me, didn't ask too many questions about my past. When she did ask, I told her I was a widower, that my wife had died in a car accident and I'd come west to start over. You told her I was dead. It was easier than explaining the truth. Easier than admitting I was a coward who'd abandoned his family. And after a while it felt true. The Harold who'd lived here with you and Tommy and our Sarah felt like someone else, someone I used to be. The lies had compounded over time. One false story led to another, until Harold had created an entire fictional past that painted him as a tragic widower instead of a deadbeat father. When Sarah fell in love with him, when she wanted to marry him, Harold had convinced himself that his old life was truly over, that he could start fresh without ever looking back. "We were happy," he said, and the simple statement hit me like a slap. "I know that hurts you to hear, but it's true. Sarah was a good woman, and I loved her. Not the way I loved you, that was different, that was first love, young love. But I loved her. We built a life together, had children together, grew old together. While your real children grew up thinking their father didn't love them enough to stay." Harold's shoulders shook with sobs. "I thought about you every day. About Tommy and our Sarah. I wondered how you were, what you were doing, whether you'd moved on and found someone better. But I couldn't come back. How could I? What would I say? Sorry I've been gone for 3 years, but I was a coward and a thief, and I built a new life because it was easier than facing what I'd done. So instead you stayed away for 41 years. Time kept passing, and it got harder and harder to imagine coming back. My other children were born, and they needed me. Sarah, the other Sarah, she depended on me. I couldn't abandon another family, couldn't leave more children without a father." The irony was bitter and sharp. Harold had stayed with his second family to avoid doing to them what he'd already done to us. His sense of responsibility had kicked in 40 years too late. "When did you stop sending money?" I asked. Harold looked confused. "Money? To us? When did you stop sending us money?" "I never sent you money." The words hung in the air between us like an accusation. "Never? Not once in 41 years. I couldn't risk it. If you'd traced it back to me, if you'd found out I was alive. You were protecting yourself, not us. I was protecting everyone. My other family didn't know about you. If they'd found out I'd been lying about being a widower, if they'd discovered I had another wife and children, they would have left you, just like they did when they finally found out." Harold's face crumpled. "Sarah got sick last year. Cancer. The doctors said she needed to get her affairs in order, and she wanted to know about my first wife, wanted me to show her pictures, tell her stories. She said she felt guilty for loving a man whose heart still belonged to someone else. So you told her the truth." "I had to. She was dying, Rose. I couldn't let her die thinking she'd married a widower when I had a wife who might still be alive somewhere. So I told her everything, about you, about Tommy and our Sarah, about the gambling and the running and the lies." Sarah, the other Sarah, had forgiven him, but their children hadn't been so understanding. When she died 6 months later, they'd made it clear that Harold was no longer welcome in their lives. They'd discovered that their entire foundation had been built on deception, that the father they'd loved and trusted had been living a lie for 40 years. "They told me I was dead to them," Harold said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Said they never wanted to see me again, never wanted their children to know they had a grandfather who was capable of such betrayal. So you came back to me. I came home because I had nowhere else to go." The brutal honesty of it was like a knife to the heart. Not because he loved me, not because he'd missed me, not because he wanted to make amends for 4 decades of abandonment. He'd come back because I was the only person left who didn't know the truth about who he really was. "The kidnapping story," I said. "I spent months crafting it, making sure it would explain everything without making me look like the villain. I thought if I could convince you I'd been a victim too, maybe you'd forgive me. Maybe we could start over." "Start over?" I laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Harold, I'm 79 years old. You're 81. We don't get to start over. We're at the end, not the beginning." Harold reached across the table toward me, but I pulled my hands away before he could touch them. "Rose, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I can never make up for what I've done. But I'm here now, and I want to try." "Try what?" "To be the husband you should have been 40 years ago. To be the father Tommy and Sarah needed when they were growing up. To be the grandfather your grandchildren deserved to know. Yes. All of that. I know it's too late, but it is too late. It's 41 years too late." I stood up from the table, suddenly exhausted by the weight of this conversation, by the effort it took to keep breathing when everything inside me felt broken beyond repair. Harold watched me with desperate eyes, probably calculating what story might still save him, what words might make me forgive the unforgivable. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked at this stranger who wore my husband's face, this man who'd stolen 41 years of my life, and then had the audacity to come back for more. The smart thing would be to throw him out, to call the police, to make sure he faced consequences for the pain he'd caused. The practical thing would be to protect myself from further hurt by cutting him out of my life completely. But I was tired of being smart and practical. I'd been smart and practical for 41 years, and where had it gotten me? I was an old woman with grown children who worried about my sanity, and no one to blame but myself for the life I'd wasted waiting for a lie. "You can stay for 2 weeks," I said finally. 2 weeks to figure out where you're going next, to make arrangements for your future. "But you're not staying here, Harold. This isn't your home anymore." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you. Rose, thank you so much. Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because despite everything you've done, despite all the lies and betrayal and abandonment, I can't bring myself to send you away to die alone. That's not who I am. I know. You always were the better person. No, I wasn't. I was just the stupider one. The one who believed in love and faithfulness and keeping promises, even when the person you made them to was building a life with someone else." Harold flinched as if I'd struck him. "I'm sorry. God, Rose, I'm so sorry. I know you are. You're sorry you got caught, sorry your other family rejected you, sorry you had to come crawling back to the woman you abandoned. But you're not sorry for the 41 years you stole from me. You're not sorry for the life you built while I worked 3 jobs to hold our family together. You're not sorry for letting our children grow up thinking their father didn't love them. I am sorry for all of that. More sorry than you'll ever know. Sorry isn't enough. It doesn't give me back the years I lost. It doesn't undo the damage you did to Tommy and Sarah. It doesn't make any of this right." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden Harold had been tending for 3 weeks. The same garden where I'd imagined him working beside me if he ever came home. Now I knew he'd been gardening for 40 years, just in someone else's yard, for someone else's family. "The hardest part," I said without turning around, "is that I still love you. After everything, the lies, the abandonment, the other family, there's still a piece of my heart that belongs to the man I married all those years ago. But love isn't always enough, is it, Harold? Rose, it's not enough to build a life on. It's not enough to sustain a marriage. It's not enough to forgive 41 years of betrayal. Love is what kept me waiting for you. Love is what made me believe your kidnapping story, even when my instincts told me something was wrong. Love is what's keeping me from throwing you out right now." I turned back to face him, this broken old man who'd once been the center of my world. "But love is also what's telling me I deserve better than to spend what's left of my life trying to rebuild something that was never real to begin with." Harold's face was wet with tears, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to call Tommy and Sarah and tell them the truth. All of it. I want you to apologize to them for the childhood you stole, for the father they deserve to have. And then I want you to find somewhere else to live and leave us alone. And after that, you live with the consequences of your choices. Just like I've been doing for 41 years. The phone rang then, Sarah's ringtone cutting through the tension like a knife. I answered it, grateful for the interruption, for a voice that belonged to my real life instead of the nightmare Harold had dragged back into it. "Mom." Sarah's voice was tight with concern. "I've been thinking about Dad being back, and I want to come see you. Tommy too. We'll fly in this weekend." I looked at Harold, hunched over the kitchen table like a man at his own trial. "That would be good, sweetheart. There are some things we all need to discuss. Is everything okay? You sound strange." "Everything's fine. We'll talk when you get here." After I hung up, Harold looked at me with something that might have been hope. "Our children are coming. My children are coming. To meet the stranger who claims to be their father, and to help me figure out how to move forward with what's left of my life. Rose, please. Give me a chance to make this right." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Make it right? How do you make 41 years of abandonment right? How do you apologize for stealing someone's entire adult life? How do you explain to grown children that their father was alive and well, and raising other children, while they wondered what they'd done wrong? You had 41 years to make it right, Harold. You chose to spend those years with another family instead. Now you'll have to live with that choice. I left him sitting in the kitchen with the broken coffee mug and his phone full of evidence, surrounded by the ruins of the story he'd spent 3 weeks building. There was laundry to finish, phone calls to make, preparations for the weekend when my real family would come together to deal with the stranger who'd invaded our lives. Harold called after me as I reached the stairs. "Rose, I do love you. I've always loved you." I paused with my hand on the banister, not turning around. "I know you do. That's what makes this so much worse. Because love without loyalty, without honesty, without commitment, isn't really love at all. It's just a feeling as fleeting and unreliable as the man who'd claimed it while building a life with someone else. I'd wasted 41 years loving a ghost. I wouldn't waste what time I had left trying to resurrect him. 2 weeks. Harold had 2 weeks to figure out his next move, and then Rose Patterson would finally be free to discover who she might have been if she hadn't spent her life waiting for a man who was never coming home. Some stories don't have happy endings, but sometimes the best you can hope for is the strength to write a new chapter. At 79, I was finally ready to pick up the pen. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe and like this video to continue listening to this type of story daily, and also to appreciate this community too. I would like to know the country in which you are listening to this story. Which country is that? Please comment below.